Dragica will be here in a second. She's in fact here already. So fantastic, because all this leads in perfectly, and the subject she's going to talk about, risk management, is going to be very important going forward. And she's got fantastic material. So welcome, Dragica. We can't see you at the moment. I'm sure we will in a second.
My camera is on.
Yes. Oh, is it?
It is definitely on. It's
okay. 1 second.
Connected.
You don't have that little cover on top of that, right?
Well, it's not this straight. Huh.
I had my camera on, but
yeah, it's on. It's I'm looking at this. It's definitely on. I had this issue a few days ago, and it was corrected. I had to restart my laptop and everything, but
don't worry about it. We'll
forgive me for this.
No problem.
I seem to be having the same issue as Anne did, and I was watching her earlier.
No problem. Dragica has got a fantastic background. She'll tell you. So I will let you go ahead, and then we'll come into the question and answers thing of discussion, right?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I founded Uvidi Management Group quite a number of years ago, and the main purpose of my company is to provide risk management support and resources to companies. And so we've been in business about 26 years. I personally have been involved in risk management for over 30 years, largely in financial services. Then I moved into healthcare, government, mining, and have also, for the last 15 years, been teaching in adult and executive education on risk management. And I take a little bit of a different perspective with risk, and be happy to share some thoughts with you on that.
I muted myself. Just do you want to walk through some of the concepts and then we can talk, or
sure. Well, excuse me, the concepts, you know, it basically, we subscribe to the two most important standards in the world on risk management, and that's the COSO standard, which has been updated continually to the present day, but also ISO 31000. And I was actually part of the Canada team in developing the ISO standard quite a number of years ago. So being able to manage risk so that you can achieve your objectives is the main message. However, one of the questions that is one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what exactly are you managing? And I think this is one of the most important questions to be able to answer. And in the way that I teach it is for professional certifications as well, is to help people to understand risk management from the perspective that you don't just set an objective and then try and figure out what are the risks to that objective. You know, I've always said there is not a straight line between risk and objectives. In there, what's in between is you have to know what those objectives are going to look like when you achieve them. So having your outcomes defined is super important. So that's a concept. And in a lot of organizations, those are called KPIs, key performance indicators. The other piece is, what is your strategy going to be? So being able to talk about a strategy in the context of achieving those objectives is really important. And oftentimes, one of the things that gets entirely left out in the conversation is, what are the assumptions? Because as soon as you change an assumption, you're going to affect your strategy in some way, right? So if your strategy failed, why did it fail? Well, possibly you changed some of the assumptions. The other piece that I always introduce in teaching and training, and in bringing in a program for an organization, is something called conditions. right? So there has to be an awareness of what the conditions are, internal and external to the organization. So those are really the founding concepts that I always promote need to be in place.
Are you seeing, when you look at corporate world today, in terms of all the challenges that are there now that COVID-19 pressed the reset button, everybody's in agreement that it didn't create the problem, it exposed them and amplified them, right?
Yeah.
The underlying, from a risk management standpoint now, if you're advising a big organization, where would they look right now and say, if I get biggest bang for buck, I need to take step back and look at these following areas?
So the biggest thing that I think they need to look at, and I think they need to look at very, very quickly, it is going to be all of those aspects around which there's a degree of uncertainty, right? So there's been a lot of initiatives in different industries over the last few years. They've been going digital, right? And so a lot of that has been accelerated. It's exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in organizations. And, you know, this was also mentioned earlier in the day, especially when John Ruffalo was speaking, is that we've been exposing weaknesses and vulnerabilities throughout all of this. And that's what's creating the uncertainty going forward. But it's really, you know, those uncertainties that really, really matter. And what I urge companies to do now is stop a little bit of the complexity. We need to simplify a little bit, right? And digital initiatives were really supposed to bring some of that, right? So as an example, in the banking industry, self-service and all, you know, online services, we're supposed to simplify things. And so looking at, you know, where are all the complexities, not only is business complex enough, sometimes we're making it too complicated, right? So that's what I mean about where are your vulnerabilities, where are your weaknesses, what is it that you're uncertain of? And those are really the first things to be able to look at. People want to have a sense of normalcy, you know, going forward. Kids going back to school, being able to get back to the workplace. Working from home was really great for a while, but I think a lot of people just really do want to get out. You know, somebody would like to get on a plane and go off somewhere. So we need to establish a normalcy, but it's going to be something we haven't seen before. It's going to be entirely different.
One of the risks that's going to be created out of this, you know, normally, although the communication in some of the big companies may not be the greatest, and water cooler effect, as we call it, where you talk to people all the time, you find out things maybe that were not communicated well because of silos, that was kind of worked around. Now we don't have that, right? Because people are working from how, what role do you think it will play, and how would you go around that now to fix that?
Well, I think there's been a lot of interesting efforts to try and bring people together, and, you know, Zoom or, you know, WebEx, a lot of the tools to bring people together have been widely used, and it's really been our only source to bring people together for now. However, I think as we slowly move beyond the restrictions that we've had for, you know, we're in 20 weeks now already, people are starting to you know, use patios. So work groups are starting to get together half a dozen at a time, you know, or even 10 at a time in different social places. Parks have become, you know, I see it in the community where I am. I see people having business meetings with, their laptops or tablets and so on in parks. And the water cooler, you're absolutely right, the water cooler conversation is gone. But people have been very resourceful in terms of how they come together. And one of the things that social media has enabled is, I think this is part of what we've seen a slow transition to, is everybody is about sharing their experiences now, right? So it isn't so much about the gossip that you might have had around the water cooler at one point in time. It's really become more about sharing the experience. So I think we're moving into a whole new phase of what we have replaced the water cooler conversations around. So social media is becoming a big tool for people sharing experiences, their thoughts, their feelings, their fears, their dreams and plans. And I think it's just going to get a lot bigger.
So isn't there a potential risk that as people get together in their own little groups, the water cooler meant that even if you didn't deal with that department, you were not likely to have a Zoom call with them. You would have bumped into them, say, "Oh, we're doing this," and so yeah, I'm working on that same thing. From there, the other guys were picking up. Now the meetings, Zoom and all, will be for that department only, right? Unless the organization creates a culture of bringing people together, which I haven't seen so far. But if they do that, that part could get lost. Like Samir was talking about this morning, that there is going to be a fatigue kick in some point in time, because as people are working from home, the hours, what is the work hour? People are working late at night, weekends, nobody knows when the weekend is, and so forth. How do you deal with that so that people, A, don't get burnt out, but B, the conversation is not only in that little department, but broader? How would you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the risk of fatigue is no longer a risk. I think it's already become a problem.
Okay.
Okay, yes. And I think it became a problem in about week 8, when the novelty of working from home, because you had to take the dog out 3 times, the kids wanted attention, or, for some people who are single people, being at home isolated for 8 weeks was no fun. So I think I work with a client, and it's a very large organization with several thousand people, and they have become very sensitive to the fact that the fatigue has already set in, but they have to persevere. They're not backing away yet. There is still the risk that if you bring a certain number of people into the office, you're going to raise the risk of exposure, to the virus. So I think we're going to have to live with that for a while, unless they start to do outdoor activities. And geographically, for some organizations, that's just not possible. When you get to December, that won't be possible. I learned the other day that a university that I work with, they have declared that nobody's going back to the office until next July.
Like Google.
That's another, this is an actual university. And, and I've been talking to the people on the faculty and saying, what do you think about that? It's absolutely going to expose a lot of issues and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And so, you have to go into this bit of an assessment mode, assess the risk, because one of the risks that is really emerging is the whole mental health situation, right? It is exposing people to certain stresses that they've never had, bouts of depression from time to time, and they never knew what this was. So going forward, you know, we're really talking about the future of business and technology, and this has been, you know, sort of discussed throughout the day, is that we are going to, as a society, going to have to get quite innovative with how we're going to relate. Because if we can't be one-on-one, if we can't be in a meeting room with everybody, and we're getting very fatigued with Zoom or, you know, any such tool, it's going to have, you know, we're going to have to figure out how this is going to happen. I don't have all the answers. I don't have that many answers, but the future is going to be quite different than I think what we had imagined. It's just going to be a matter of exploring things we hadn't even considered before and just taking a whole lot of imagination to get there.
That's actually very interesting with the health angle. From a risk standpoint, just like from an audit standpoint, when you talk to people, you find out things, not just one area. For risk and audit and people like that, and security, is really important that they be connected right across, right? To understand from different areas what's going on, because you're looking for the risks for the entire organization. That gets challenging in this area, especially with the siloed approach that was always there before, right? So it creates a little problem. The second, we've talked about the skills gap, because technology moved so fast that, and people bought all the shiny toys and whatever, and they were never even operating it properly. But now, from a risk standpoint, how do you actually go to understand where the weaknesses are, what needs to be understood, reviewed, because, you know, the what, why, where, and those type of questions that you would ask normally in the lowest rank. I found out information by talking to the most junior guy in the organization that normally would not even be part of any conversation. How would you deal with that type of thing?
So I thank you for that question. Actually, that's a question I really like to answer, because, so you remember earlier you asked me, you know, what the concepts are. So one of the concepts is, you know, the conditions, right? And so I always ask companies, what conditions do you stipulate need to exist in order to be able to execute an important strategy, right? And so when you look at an enterprise level, you want to understand, what do you need of your people to be able to execute? What do you need of all of the various different processes that you have in the organization to be able to execute? What do you need in terms of all the interdependencies? What would be, you know, kind of systems thinking, those systems, but also of technology to be able to do that? And what do you need to be aware of in terms of what's going on outside the organization that could impact you in terms of being able to execute? And so I'll use a very simple example. When you're setting up an important project, right? So, you know, do you ask all these questions? If you're the lead program or project manager, you know, are these questions being asked? Do I have enough people, the right people, the willingness of the people to do what needs to be done? Do we have a good management process, and so on and so forth? And so often these very, you know, 4 areas are, the answers aren't being provided sufficiently. And, you know, that represents the capabilities, the people, the processes, systems, and awareness of everything internal and external that could impact you. And so that's what I refer to as the capabilities. But in my experience, the best way to be able to discuss the capabilities is to not just, you know, call it a capability. Do you have the competencies? Do you have the capacity? And do you have the will to act? And the definition of these 3 is what makes up capabilities. So If you don't have the three all at the same time, you don't have capabilities. If you've only got two, you still don't have capability. Any two, you don't have capabilities. And that's, that's the important emphasis that I make all the time. So when there's gaps in that, that is, the opportunity to improve. That's the opportunity to close the gap.
That's actually fantastic. Now, that leads to a very interesting thing. And it comes out of the fact that a couple of days ago, on Monday, I was talking to two different people who are senior, who run the systems in their organization. One is in the government, the other one is a big organization downtown, pretty big. And he said to me, he's very frustrated because things have gone on hold because they're working from home, so forth. He said, I can't wait to get back into the office, which they're not going to be doing anytime soon, so that they can start the project. Now that blew me away, because I said to him, hang on, what was the project? So he told me. I said, why would you do that project when you go back? And he said, it's been approved. We have the budget, it's been approved. I said, I don't care. Things have changed. What you were going to do is no longer required. The other things are required. The approach from the government side was, but we have to do this because it's been approved. We've got to do this. Money was allocated. But why would you do something from a risk management standpoint, even for our system? Why would you do something which now is not going to be required? Because with the fact that behavior pattern are changing of people working from home, even if they go back to, I know financial institutions are looking at strip malls and stuff like that to move some of their people around, because they don't want people using the elevators and all that downtown. So there's a lot of thinking going on. Why would you continue with the project? And how do you, from a risk management, intervene to try and educate this guy, saying, no, freeze it, review the requirements. What was the purpose, which is what you said? What was the objective of doing this? If it was that has changed. You need to go back to the drawing board. Don't waste money. Are you seeing that as a risk also?
Most definitely. And this is part of what I teach with risk management, is that risk-based decision making that that allows you to look at a project, and people are going to say, yes, but we've sunk so much money into a project. Well, okay, so if it's a $5 million project and you've sunk $3 million into it, what more is it going to take? Is that 5 million going to become 10, right? And you still may not achieve that objective? Or do you say, it's a loss, we're going to write it off, move on, right? So that usually it's having that really, critical look at what has actually been accomplished for the money you've sunk. And are you going to go the rest of the way with the money that's left? Or are you going to sink a whole lot more? And that's a tough bullet for some to accept. But sometimes it's really necessary. It's absolutely necessary. And, look at the pros, look at the cons. What are your barriers in place that are going to stop you from getting to the end game within budget? It's about scope, because what the three corners are. And if one of them is broken, then what do you do, right? So look at it critically.
So that's actually very interesting. And I think the culture, one of the things that I was able to relate back to what he was saying, is that he did not want to stop the project or say anything, because the blame nobody wants to stop the project and take the responsibility. That, they think it's going to bounce back on them, that why did you not think about that before or whatever. So they continue. Now, tied to the same project is that when you get to February, because the March, whatever is a year end for, especially if you are a government, they will run around to spend the money like crazy. Not because it's the right thing, right? because they got the budget and they know if they don't spend it, they won't get it another year. How would you try and change that culture?
Well, it's not about just about it. I mean, that's a bigger culture question.
Right,
So,
it is.
you know, you've got some organizations that are very good at defining the risk culture,
Mm-hmm.
and it really all has to do with, you know, how they organize their priorities, how they organize the communication. You know, where are the 1, 2, and 3 priorities. So, you know, changing a culture isn't just about a conversation around risk.
No.
It's how people change, it's how people communicate, it's how close to the edge is an organization willing to go. So that's really all about risk appetite and risk tolerance, which simply means how much of what, right? Are we willing to go to the edge? So, but this is a transformative culture shift. And as we all know, digital was supposed to be what was going to transform a lot of businesses. And so, for a lot of businesses, going digital was a really big risk. So you want to think about how did they approach it? Did they do it from a current culture perspective, or did they do it from the culture we want to build perspective, right? So if you don't know what it is that you want to build, you're never going to know what your starting point is, because there's never an end point. It's a journey, right?
Absolutely.
So then you want to think about are you doing this because you want to do it for the customer experience, for the employees' experience? Are you wanting to do it because you're taking a lot of fat out of the organization, which, you know, was a very commendable goal for many? Do you really want to transform your operating model, right? So, you know, what is going to be your driver? Or, as a mistake was made in many, that this was a technology project. And that is absolutely not where you start a culture conversation.
That's right.
Right? So you start with the journey, knowing that it's going to take a while. You want to know what your priority is on that journey and what needs to change on the path. And then you bring the technology along to support the vision. Right. That's the risk management process at every step of the way.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. I think, you know, if you look at the like the CEO panel we had and how they think,
yeah.
If everybody was running organization like that, we wouldn't have problem, because they understand exactly. But I think there is a problem there. So some of these people have insulated themselves, unlike the 4 we heard today, who have got their pulse on what's going on and are grounded very, very well, understand. I think some of them are insulated. They don't want to hear the bad news. And what happens that you don't find out. And then, you know, it's the Warren Buffett thing that I put out there a couple of days ago, which is only when the tide goes out do you find out who's been swimming naked, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's pretty powerful that, and I think it's exposing people and companies, because I think the leadership has to think like the way what we heard today, because if they do that, they'll take people along. But if they don't do that, so the question then becomes, are you not like technology, like we said, is an enabler, but you have to drive from business. Canadians not being risk takers is not helping. Changing the culture, like you said, is a big thing. I totally agree. It's not an overnight. But if they were to really drill down, this is a reset time, right? Would you not agree that this is reset time? If they take a step back and rethink, what is it my customer wants, right?
Yeah.
And then go from there back out and saying, why are we doing this? And they will stop doing a lot of things because they don't need to do that, right?
Well, yes, but you're touching on something that is just starting to get attention.
Yeah.
And that's this whole design thinking, which is supposed to be, customer centric. And I see, design projects going on in organizations, and they're customer centric, or they say they are customer centric organizations, but I've yet to see what the customers said they wanted. So I think there's a little bit of that going on in a lot of organizations. They presume what the customer wants, as opposed to doing surveys, asking customers, talking to customers when they come into their business, and really getting a firsthand feel. I'll give you a prime example. I got an email 2 days ago, Monday, from an organization saying, we're going to become much more customer centric. We're changing, these services to better support your need in this area. And I'm reading this email and I'm thinking, but you never asked me. And this is, I think, a really, really big risk, so the whole concept of design in business is a fabulous concept. But I think there's a couple of steps that I've witnessed that are entirely missed, and that is actually engaging the customer in the redesign process, because it's intended to be customer-centric thinking. So, I think that some of this is not going to go away. I think it's something that's kind of survived all of these years of doing it a certain way, and that's just building more risk. But here's the thing. So in a number of projects that I've seen, or strategic initiatives that are not exactly going so well, and I read the risk reports, and as I read these risk reports, the language that's being used in these reports talks about, well, we saw this happen and this happened and this happened. And when you really dig down into what are you trying to tell me in this risk register, is that you're telling me about problems. Well, guess what? This is called a risk register, not a problem register. And therein lies a lot of the cultural problem around risk reporting, because risk is in the future, right? It hasn't happened yet. So you have to be able to anticipate what could happen. But instead they're telling me about problems and why we have this problem, we have that problem, and so on. And that doesn't help to inform whether it's senior management or even at the board level. And I've seen these at the board level, which kind of brings in the whole other conversation around risk governance. So I did risk governance programs for a large organization for 10 years. One of the things that I have found in risk governance is that more often than not, I've witnessed where board members actually don't understand the risk management process. And so it becomes difficult to ask the questions. So everybody likes to ask questions, but they're asking questions about risk management because they don't understand what it is that they are supposed to govern. And so it would behoove many boards, I would suggest, to really understand the risk management process so that they are then consequently able to govern very effectively. So, when you pull all of that together, you've got yet another touch point on what's the culture, of risk in an organization.
Education of the board is one of them, like you just said. For sure. Without doubt, I've had that first-hand experience of having to deal with that. The do you believe that we are caught up in the buzzwords? Also, right, we don't do plain speak, in other words, and that creates the gap in kind of what you said is not what I heard, what I said is not what I meant, kind of nonsense in that there's no effective or clear communication in many organizations. In some
Right.
there is, and would you not say that's a very big risk?
That's a huge risk. And one of the things, you know, when the standards were established, going back to early like 2003 and 4, when standards were initially established, one of the very first things that were suggested, recommended for organizations is to establish a taxonomy, establish language in the organization so that we all know what we're talking about. But that takes time and it takes work, and then it needs to be consistent. But that's not happening. So when you ask someone about risk appetite or risk tolerance or risk governance and different words that are commonly used by people who are risk professionals, they're not being used in your typical organization. And so I always encourage, I've got a 4-page handout that I give to my clients and say, okay, here is, kind of standard language that if everybody uses it, everybody will know what we're talking about. And then the other thing I hand everybody out is, here's 4 pages, and this is what's considered leading practices, not best practices, leading practices. And it becomes so much easier to communicate. And the reason it becomes so much easier to communicate is because, and I want to make a real point of this, is that typically in most organizations, what is being discussed are risk events, right? And there was mention of that earlier when you were talking about insurance. And organizations, in financial institutions, they have capital that's, is there for certain risks that could be cost heavy. And then lots of organizations, of course, have insurance against certain events. But risk isn't always about an event, right? And I think it's important, and this I think is what is going to take us to the future of understanding how we're going to be able to create value. And so there's 3 other really important characteristics about risk, that it's not just an event. There's also the ambiguity that surrounds risk, right? So going forward, we're going to have to really think about what it is that we don't fully understand, right? So there's a lack of knowledge about, a certain situation or certain, class of customers and so on. So what risks does ambiguity present to an organization? So, and the other one is variability. And this is another aspect of risk. For example, clients now ask me, how are we going to plan going forward? Our plans are not going to be as simple to pull together as they have been in the past. So, and I say, well, now you're going to have some variability risk. And so what does that mean? Well, you have to start talking about ranges more, as opposed to, we're going to spend $1 million on X. Well, no, you may be spending somewhere between 800,000 and 2 million, as opposed to having a budget figure. So, that variability that we're heading into, and that's just, it's always been there. It's just not been acknowledged by all kinds of businesses and organizations the way that I think it's going to have to be going forward. And the better you're able to understand the ambiguity and variability, the better you're going to be able to position for the future. And then the last one, and this is the one that's probably the type of risk that's most scary for a lot of organizations. And it's the emerging risk, right? It's what's unknown or even unknowable. And especially with this coronavirus, because rightfully so, I believe it was Chris who mentioned earlier, is that we're going to have waves. So it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. We're going to have waves of this. And possibly for the next 18, 24, maybe 36 months, right? It's unknowable at this point in time. And again, back to how do you plan? How do you reach out to customers? How do you hire or lay off people? Adjust your workforce, right? So these are new factors. Well, they're not that new, quite frankly. No, they're not new at all, but they're going to have to be top of mind going forward, that it's not just about an event.
It's very interesting what you just talked about in terms of risk. I give you a simple example and tell me if that culture is still existing and it poses a bigger risk. Now, this is for the financial institution. I don't know if you remember, I'm not trying to date myself, but we used to have what was called negative file bulletin in the bank, which was that if you are a merchant and you accept a credit card, right? If it's not on your piece of paper here, then it's good. So it was called the negative file bulletin because we didn't have all this automated system like we do today, right? So we would submit each week, and then we went to CDs to say, okay, we'll send CDs out. So I'm talking late 80s and early 90s. So I looked at it and I said, why the heck are we doing this? Let's stop. Stop this thing. We were spending $2.7 million sending this thing out. When I stopped it, I think everybody else wanted to hang me and throw me from the 26th floor or whatever, because they were so attached to this. The year end came, we took $49,000, $50,000 in fraud, right? And they were very upset. But all we did, that 49,000 included the fact that the minute there was a fraud on something, we wrote it off and gave them a few dollars as a credit to make him happy, right? But we saved $2.7 million, right? And that was a risk thinking to say that every risk is to be known. Every risk doesn't need to be fixed because there are some that just don't rise up. But you need to understand. And I think we're not doing that now. We're not understanding the risks that are coming out now, and we are reluctant to change. And that could be very detrimental for survival of a lot of organizations. Would you agree?
I would agree. And it's interesting that you say this is really about financial institutions. And, you know, financial institutions are very good at breaking down all the different kinds of risks. So, you know, you've got credit risk, you got market risk, you got operational, you have so much. But, you know, credit risk, I think, is one of the ones that you might be referencing, at least in credit card processing. Right. A lot of that would likely be written off, you know, because of credit and so on. But it's really, in a lot of instances, it's operational risk.
Yes, it is.
Right? Yep. And this is, you know, in financial institutions, it's called operational risk. The rest of the world would call it enterprise risk, because people, process, systems, external factors, and so on, right? And what I have learned with teaching in over 15 years now, and having the privilege of being inside every single, well, most financial institutions, not only in Canada, but Europe and the US, is I see the amount of effort that has to go into understanding and then qualifying and quantifying operational risk. There's a lot of effort that goes into it. And then it's just easier to just write it off to credit risk, which I vehemently oppose to. Yeah. And, you know, if you could really break down your operational risks, and I've tried with banks, and, you know, the feeling is it's just too much work. And we have capital, we provide for these losses, and so why are we going to, but the thing is, if you don't spend the time to really get the whole act together,
right,
then you're missing out on an opportunity to really, take an uptick on your performance, on innovation and creativity, and really start to explore some new opportunities. Because when I see, mid-level management going through the exercise that I've put them through with operational risk, quite a lot of light bulbs come on. And they see how they're now creating value, performance is better, they've closed the gaps, and they've reduced the risk considerably. So, and then consequently what they've done is they've reduced the amount of the write-off, right? So there's a lot of value in putting the effort in up front, but it's appreciating what you're going to get at the end.
So there's two parts to this. Is the lack of skills and expertise, because we are seeing a lot of that disappear, contributing to this problem, and ethics. Lack of ethics certainly is a very big risk for organization. You want to speak to that?
Right. So, I've been a big advocate for conduct risk, right? And to me, conduct risk is built on the backbone of the culture of an organization. And it's ethics are not just about the way people behave or how they speak or how they present themselves. It's also about how they do work, and how do you build your processes? Do you cut corners just to get from point A to point B? Do you leave out certain elements that expose you to risk, which frankly should be uncovered by audit? And, and you and I have had this conversation before,
yes.
Where audit is always generally backward looking, risk is forward looking. But one of the things that sits in the middle of audit and risk is compliance. Because I've always said compliance is a choice. There are rules, there are regulations that say you should do this. But unless you do it, you have made a decision, you've made a choice at a very specific moment in time to not comply with X. And that is the conduct piece, that's the ethical piece. And this is the point where you've made that decision, and all of a sudden, by virtue of that choice or decision, you've exposed the organization to risk. Because what will be the outcome of you not complying, right? A prime example that highlights this is what was happening in one of the big international banks around money laundering in not Canada, in another country. But it exposed that organization to billions and billions of dollars in fines because a decision was made, audit didn't catch it after the fact, and the risk wasn't recorded, right? So you've got a huge breach of the ethics that are the underbelly, of the regulations. And it's a big deal. The ethics in an organization, it's not about a piece of paper that says this is how it is. It's about the behaviors, it's about how things get done, it's about the interactions of how everything comes together. And when you think about it, there are a lot of organizations now that have 4 generations in their pool of employees, and some of them even have 5. People as young as 18 coming into the workplace, if they're in an internship or anything like that, and people that are 75 and 80 who are still in the workplace. I mean, if you, a small example, Dr. Fauci in the US around the whole coronavirus, he's almost 80 years old. And then you've got young interns that are coming in at 18, 19, 20 years old. That represents about 5 generations of people in the workplace. The conduct is going to be different, but how the ethics are perceived in each mindset are going to be different. And if everybody doesn't align to what the culture wants the ethics to be, then you're going to be all over the map. And that's you know, an entire region of risk that I think is going to be popping in the next, I give it, you know, the next 2-3 years, and that's going to get a much closer look at.
So actually that's a very important, I think, area you touched. With the potential unemployment, which we will see even at the banks for that matter, because they're going to take a pretty heavy hit on the credit losses, right? Right off that will happen because a lot of people are either without job or will be without job for a while. Isn't that the time is ripe for people to do wrong things? Because I talked earlier about background checks. We don't do that, right? We did it when we hired somebody and they might be in sensitive role. And that's going to pose a very big risk to a lot of organizations where you got people in sensitive areas and you don't know whether the guy is in financial trouble. His wife may have lost a job. They both were doing it, or he could be potentially losing his job. And we don't know what he can or cannot do because there's a lot. So are we dealing with that as a potential risk here?
Yes, we are. We certainly are. And, you know, you're referencing financial institutions where you still have a lot of legacy systems, and the legacy systems contain such a huge amount of information.
Right.
You know, then you've got all these multiple external databases, and, you know, who has access, you know, how is access monitored? And, you know, we talked about privacy and security of data throughout the day.
Right.
And it is going to become more and more vulnerable, I think, as the stress on the system becomes more and more. And it is going to stress systems more and more because they're going to have to bring in more security, and that's just going to be more layers and more patchwork. So, you know, which kind of brings me right back to, you know, complexity management. And, you know, how do you get the right people at the right time with the right knowledge to do the right thing? And I think this is where everybody's grappling. And of course, with a distributed workforce everywhere, I mean, I think my home office has a pretty secure environment, but does it? You know, have I put everything in place that will protect, you know, what I hold, and what about everybody else's home who's working from home? And you've got a lot of technical support people that are also working remotely and not in a secure environment. Yes, I think there's, I think we're headed for a significant amount of risk.
Correct.
Yeah.
You know, one of the dangers for the companies has been, and you can comment, the statement I make is for very good reason because I've seen it firsthand, is a lot of companies are spending a hell of a lot of money on who they are rather than who they should be. Right?
Yeah.
If you look at even the training and the things they're doing, is the money is being spent on who they are when they should actually be spending on who they should be. And that creates its own risk, as you said, because you got potential of resource constraints. So people might move out jobs. We know there's lack of jobs on the security side of things because experienced people are being grabbed. I mean, if you look at the SANS report that talking about 2% to 11% proficiency on people who are coming into security. Are you kidding me? But that's who, so what are we going to do if that's the pool of people we've got? How are we going to lift them up, train them, get them? So I don't know if everybody's looking at that, right?
Well,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I wrote an article fairly recently that I shared with you, and it's to do around that. They write marketing messages and sales messages around who they are, and while that's all great, a lot of it is really all about self-perception, right? And we all want to put the best image forward. But I think more and more people are, and this started, in the last couple of years or so, people are slowly starting to move away from that. And people are sharing experiences way more. But I think from what's the message that gets out into the world? I think that's starting to create a little bit of a conflict. Here's why. As you say, companies are putting out who they are, and right? So that's a lot of information going out into the marketplace. But then there's the customer who can and has a tremendous amount of influence to be able to really highlight who is that company. Why? Because they're sharing their experience with that company, right? And that's starting to take a very dominant place in social media. And so even if companies wanted to talk about who they should be, or where they're headed towards being, I think that moving into this whole sharing of experiences all over the internet, you've got not just Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, and now you've got TikTok. I mean, you've got so many people who are sharing experiences that I think companies are going to have to really rethink how they put themselves out there. And I think the messaging has to come through differently, that it's not just about literature anymore. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because they have to be able to get ahead of the risk. What is somebody going to say about us that may not be positive? So they're going to have to the messaging has to come ahead of what experiences they may be out there.
I think this has been fascinating, because what we need to do is to let you kind of have a longer session. By the way, your article is on the website, and I did put it on LinkedIn, so people who are listening to this call can go on our website. It's on the culture, and it's a very good, very, very good article. I agree.
Thank you.
And I think if you thought I was kidding, you heard for yourself. Dragica's done some fantastic stuff, and actually this worked out much better, very good in terms of having this conversation. But she's got a fantastic presentation. You saw a little bit of that. I think what we'll do is, because there are questions as well, there are some questions that is popped up, and we run out of time. But what we'll do is we'll do a one-on-one session for you to just do a full presentation and walk it through, because I think there's so much food for thought here, right? That the concepts, high level, that we put out there. And if you're a corporation and you want Dragica to look at it, her email, it's all there, and we'll make sure it's available as well. But I want to thank you. This is fantastic. Do you want to leave any parting thoughts, because we run out of time? But anything from your side?
I just want to thank you for this opportunity, Bashir. It's been entirely my pleasure. We've exchanged a lot of conversations in the last few weeks, so I just want to thank you for this, and hopefully my comments were helpful to you.
Very helpful, and I can see from some of the comments I've got here, very good, and we'll do more, and I will be in close touch with you, promise you.
Great.
So thanks very much for doing that. I really, truly appreciate that.
Thank you, Bashir.
My pleasure. All the best.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.